Here we are with lecture number 4 in the Macroeconomics Review series. This lecture will talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, how those interact in the products market. But before we start to investigate that, we want to consider the nature of the overall capacity of the economy. What is the potential output level of the economy? How do we know what that is? Well, we need to go back and look at a tool that we developed in micro, and that's the production function. We saw the production function holding all things ceteris paribus, holding all things, other things constant. We're going to investigate one input, one factor that might control and influence output levels. We're going to say that output, and here, instead of in micro, we did quantity as an implicit function of something. Here we'll say real GDP, which is output, is an implicit function of what? Well, of capital, labor. Sometimes we talk about entrepreneurship and land and some other things, but to keep it simple, we'll just say that there are two inputs right now. And we're going to imagine that capital is held constant. We'll put labor down here. Then we start to consider, because capital represents the infrastructure of the country. It represents road systems and rail systems and port systems and airports and all these things over a relatively fixed short amount of time, 1, 2, 3, 4 years. Really not that flexible, not that changeable. We don't have brand new highway systems that are being installed overnight or within even one calendar year. Those of us who live near the DC area know that I-200, the inter-county connector, which is planned for many years, still took about 2.5 years to build, and it was a fast project. So infrastructure generally is fixed over the short term. But then we'll take a look at labor. We know labor then is a very interesting, probably the most powerful factor input in production. But, well, when we consider labor, the question to ask is, how much can labor change in the short term? We know that we can change it, well, the amount of labor, total labor in an economy can change through immigration. And we could revise immigration laws, but typically in our country, it's a little controversial, and moving things through Congress is slow and laborious and typically difficult to do. So we're not going to see any change that way, and in the short term, we know. What else could we do? We could grab a whole sector of the population that's not actively participating, and that could be things like pre-teenagers, but we're not going to do that. We saw in the 70s and 80s that the percentage participation rate for women shot up dramatically and increased productivity in the economy. We had much more output because a lot of talented people suddenly entering the labor force who hadn't been there before. But women are now participating at a fairly full, normal level, somewhat equivalent to the participation rate for men. So we don't have another group out there. So, we could have natural rate of reproduction, procreation. And that's another idea, but again, it takes some amount of time to raise young children into sentient beings that can go out to the labor force and do something productive. So each one of the things is feasible, possible, improbable in the short term. Short term is, well, whatever it is in the long term, long run. So in the relevant range of time that we're investigating, the relevant short run length of time, we find that labor really isn't that flexible. And labor then is going to be somewhat fixed like this. And on this side here we have output, so let's put real GDP. We find that, well, it's then deterministic. We have some level of labor, and given that level of labor that's not very flexible relative to the output levels, we have then a level of real GDP that's determined by the labor force. We know what the potential will be. If all of this labor force were working as fully as possible, which brings us back to the national rate of unemployment, the full unemployment number of the last lecture, which was 5%. If we have something like 5% unemployment, we're looking at some output level like that real GDP. What's that look like here then? If we're trying to develop some other graph where we're changing axes now and putting real GDP down here, and we're trying to identify some relationship between real GDP and the price level, somewhat analogous to micro, a little bit different because it's not a price, but it's the overall level of the kind of average level of a market basket of goods or some group of goods that's representative of the productivity of this economy. So we have a price level here, total output of the economy over here. And we ask the question, well, what does this tell us? How does this inform us about potential output levels of the economy? Well, we look at this and say, well, we assumed in the short run that capital is fixed. We looked at labor, and labor actually is somewhat fixed in the same deterministic way, which then projects back onto real GDP, giving us a level of real GDP that tells us what the potential is. Well, if there's a specific level of real GDP that corresponds to labor force as we know it, well, here it is. Here's our real GDP that is determined by the amount of labor that we have available to us. And we're going to call this the full employment output or potential GDP, because it's the GDP that we potentially manufacture if we had full utilization of our resources. And there we are. Should be a straight line, sorry. So we have that, and we'll look at that and say, what does that tell us about the economy? Well, this has some very important assumptions. The assumption here is that the economy will be here if we have instantaneous or very quickly a quick adjustment of prices and wages. For example, if we have a downward sloping average demand curve, and I recall you to earlier discussions we had of why the average demand curve is downward sloping. There are 3 reasons, and the AP will ask those, so you need to go back and read them. We have a downward sloping average demand curve, we'll call this average demand 1. We ask, well, what happens if average demand falls off to average demand 2? Collapse of average demand through some reason or another. We're not going to explain it now, but let's just imagine it moves backwards that way. Well, according to this model, if we believe that prices and wages will adjust rather instantaneously, we find that the average demand will shift, but all that will ensue in the economy will be a determination of a new intersection of the new average demand curve and the prevailing, well, supply curve. We haven't identified which supply curve it is. And we go from an initial price level here to a new price level at the same potential output in the economy. This vision of economic adjustment in a macroeconomic sense was what prevailed before the Great Depression. People believed, eminent economists believed, that output, potential output, was the aggregate supply curve for the economy, and that prices and wages would adjust over some relevant length of time if we waited long enough, and we just find a new intersection at the same potential GDP or full employment output level. This we refer to today as the classical model. Classical model because classically, at some point in time, this was accepted by everyone. We still use it today, and we call it now the long run average supply curve. The long run average supply curve because in the long run, wages and prices will adjust. How long does it take for them to adjust? What is the long run? Well, the long run is the amount of time it takes for them to adjust. It could be, in many recessions, we see adjustment within 6 to 18 months. The economy starts to recover, it recovers rather robustly. In this last recession that started in 2007, 2008, from the housing crisis, the bubble, the asset bubbles, things are not rebounding that quickly. So we have now a new understanding of long-term. Long-term now is longer than the long run was in previous recessions. But we call it the classical long-run average supply curve. This is obviously not true in some situations. We didn't see this quick recovery in the Great Depression, and that required the profession, economics, to analyze what was wrong and develop new theories, new models. And that's exactly where we will start in the next lecture.